All right.
Are you live streaming onto YouTube, Twitter?
And now, yeah, we're live on Twitter and YouTube and Facebook. I think LinkedIn somewhere. People out there use that, I think. We're also there. All right, so we're live, folks. What's up, folks? If you're live with us or you watch later on, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good night. We're gonna get started. I'm here with Lyndsey Schlax, and I'll tell you a little bit about Lyndsey, and now I'll have her share a little bit about herself. I met Lyndsey many years ago when I was an assistant principal and she was a teacher. Some things about Lyndsey: she was a phenomenal history teacher, but also a creator of LGBTQ studies program curriculum for her school. Ended up influencing the district and featured and well known across the country as well. And she later became a school leader and has done all kinds of great things throughout that. So for me, it's just a pleasure to have you here, Lyndsey, to be able to talk and pick your brain a little bit, to do some dreaming together, and also talk about this conference that we have on. So welcome to our interview.
All right, thank you very much. That was a wonderful introduction, Joe.
Awesome. Okay, well, let's start with how do you answer this question of who are you now? What are you doing? And why? Why are you doing
it? Yeah. So I'm Lyndsey. A lot of people call me by my last name because it's kind of a unique one, which is fun, especially in the teacher world. I live in the Bay Area and I've been working in public education since I was 18 years old, on and off. I started out working in special education classrooms as an instructional assistant. And I really wanted to go into teaching, but I also really wanted to study history. So I got my undergrad in history, my undergraduate degree in history, and I did part of a special education mod severe credential at the same time. And then had this experience of explaining some really cool history to my sister one day and just realized that that was where I really needed to focus, was on this storytelling. And so I got my master's and my teaching credential from University of San Francisco, and credentialed in social science and English. And I got my national boards for social science, and then became a school administrator, got my master's in educational leadership from UC Berkeley, same program Joe went to, and so many other wonderful educational leaders in California. Now I focus a lot on telling undertold stories and making space for teachers and student leaders to advocate for what they want and to learn about their personal histories, about community histories, local histories, and how to use their knowledge to advocate. I'm in the work because I know it's incredibly important for people to be represented in curriculum, to feel represented in the curriculum and in the space and the time that they spend in schools. I mean, we spend 13 years going to school, and that's a long time. And for me, my experience of K through 12 education, I moved around a lot. I went through there were a lot of shifts and changes that happened with teachers and people that I depended on when I was in school. And it was really difficult to figure out how to make it work for me. I also didn't get diagnosed with ADHD and other stuff until I was in college and struggling. And as the parent of a child who's also neurodivergent, the knowledge that I gained from my crummy experiences and then also from seeing him go through school and my educational training, I think has allowed me to really be able to cultivate kind of a sense of inclusion and understanding and universal design practices that maybe folks who haven't had the same experiences as me they might not think to do or might not know how important it is.
I appreciate the personal connection to the work, to your kids, to back to the work and everything. I mean, that keeps us grounded and intentional.
Yeah, for sure.
So let's talk about the last couple of years, right? So, you know, you've been around long enough to know that the last couple of years aren't like all the other years, you know, like there were years before the pandemic, but we've been in this for some for some time now. How is this pandemic era of education, whether distance or in person, still in a pandemic? How's it been for you personally, and what effect have you seen it putting on the people, the kids, the adults, the teachers?
So for me personally, it was so my husband's a former Marine. And he has called the past few years my hardship tour. That it has just been intense and brutal and heartbreaking to so I come from this social studies, storytelling, instructional leadership background, but in my role, I just finished my 4th year as an assistant principal at a high school in Millbrae, California. And a lot of my role there was calendar management and facilities management, which meant that I was in charge of like making sure that the flow of masks and the flow of checking students in and testing, COVID testing and vaccination clinics and enforcement of 6-foot waiting and all of that kind of stuff was under my purview. And it was really difficult. I think everybody had so many awful or triggering or traumatic experiences during the pandemic that we all ended up being like all the way up to here, just barely keeping our heads above water, just to kind of do the normal, to show up every day, to do grading, to arrive on time, to turn in a textbook when you're supposed to, just to check email. Like all of those things were all for everyone when we're all just treading water. Every one of those things that we expect should be routine became something that required effort. And in leading a school while everybody's feeling that way, schools need more than just the bare minimum in order to do what kids need. And student needs skyrocketed during this time. In addition to facilities management, our site wellness team I was also the point admin for our site wellness team and for our 10th grade. And for folks who aren't working in high schools, you might not kind of realize for our 10th graders, the students who just finished 10th grade, their last typical year of school was 7th. Mm-hmm. They missed the end of 8th grade, and then they spent all of 9th in distance learning. So 10th grade was really their first normal, like this was a normal year, their first normal year of school since 7th grade. And there is so much social emotional development that happens in community for kids at the end of 8th and the beginning of 9th, that transition from middle school to high school. So our 10th grade had massive struggles on top of the massive mental health struggles that all of our students were having, because students nationwide are having those. And trying to find that balance and being able to take care of myself while being kind of the main point admin for most of our mental health crises and for the people who were handling most of our mental health crises, in addition to our COVID protocols, in addition to the instructional leadership that is what drives me to do the work. I have no qualms about saying I burned out. Burned out on admin. I gave everything that I had to the school that I worked at, and it cost me. And I think it costs a lot of people, actually. I don't think the district that I work in, there are only 2 of the 7 schools, only 2 are not losing an administrator in some way or another. It's just been incredibly brutal, like it has been for so many educators this year.
Yeah, I mean, I hear that everywhere, getting to talk to folks across the country, that's the reality everywhere in all positions, just this turnover, this burnout, this exodus. Yeah, I mean, we're seeing the signs of it. And, the question is, what's the roots, right? And what caused all this? And are we prepared to look at that? I'm hoping to look at some of that this summer, and over the years, we'll figure this out. But before we get to that, what kind of turnover did you see around your way? And and I know you're going through a transition yourself. Tell us about the transition.
Yeah, so like I said, of the 7 high schools in the district that I work in, 5 had administrators leave. Of those 5, I think that there are like 6 or 7 of us who are making transitions. Of those 5 schools, of those 5, 3 of us are actually returning to teaching, and I'm one of them. I made a decision in March that the classroom is really where I needed to be. So, like I said, I was in charge in my role as an administrator. I was in charge of a lot of the logistical stuff. And one of those logistics was standardized testing. CASP testing came back this year for almost everyone. And I was in charge of that. And in my, good trouble teaching days, I was always the teacher who was like, you don't have to take this. You can opt out. It's not going to accomplish anything for you. Tell your parents if you feel overwhelmed, it's all good. I believe that College Board doesn't really do much for anybody except themselves. And that there are a lot of other ways to measure learning. But this year, as in some other years, I was in charge of CASP testing, and my students, brilliant children, figured out that they could opt out, and they all talked their parents into it. And we had a massive opt-out movement at my school, which I was loving. And also it was crummy to be on the person on the receiving end, because I was still accountable to my supervisors and everybody else for it. And so it was a really difficult moment of like trying to manage all this paperwork, getting all the opt-outs correct, getting pressure from one side, and secretly wanting to cheer the kids on, but having to go through doing something that felt like it was against my own ethics, just to force kids or try to talk kids into doing it. And then at the same time, there was a disciplinary issue at our school that just was really challenging and really difficult and really heartbreaking. And I was in charge of that as well. And at the end of that week, where both of these things had happened, I was just devastated. I came home early on a Friday. I'd been crying, just feeling like I don't know how I can keep being me and keep being happy and connected if these are the kinds of things that I'm going to have to do day after day after day. And sitting there waiting for me, let's see if I don't think I have it right here with me, but sitting there waiting for me on my bed when I got home was a package from a wonderful professor at NYU named Stacy Brinsilver Berman. And Stacy had done research actually in my classroom before I became an administrator. She spent a couple of years interviewing me and my students in my LGBTQ studies class about the impact that it was having, about how we had managed to make this class happen in the first place. And she was interviewing about 13 teachers or so at the time. And her work became a dissertation, which then became a book on how to bring LGBTQ history into social science classrooms. And at the end of this week, where I was feeling like I am giving up on the morals and ethics and what I came into school leadership to do and into education to do, there was this book waiting for me, highlighting this, one of the things that feels like one of the luckiest things I've ever gotten to do in my entire career, which is to teach LGBTQ studies and to push my district and push the school and push a community towards more acceptance and inclusion and understanding. And I knew in that exact moment right there that, that while I cared very much for the people I was serving and wanted very much to do that job well, that's not where I needed to be. I needed to be back in the classroom. And so I went for it, and I'm actually going to be teaching again at Berkeley High School in the fall. I actually just got my tentative class schedule about an hour and a half ago, and I cannot wait, because Berkeley High has a history of supporting queer studies and queer representation in education, and a history of teaching young people how to be advocates for themselves and how to be civically engaged. And I know that there are a lot of folks who've been in the classroom for the past 2 years for whom that has been one of the most difficult things in the world. So I'm not saying that it's going to be easy going back into the classroom, because that's not what it's about, but it will be, I think, more joyful.
Yeah, I think it's amazing. I mean, I think, like you said, the universe brings us all kind of information and signs when we're ready to hear it or not, but it tells us, right?
Yeah.
And it's amazing that you get to build on what you started. And also just take the experience, right? And also approach this from a systems lens to think, okay, yeah, and then what, right? And how do I connect with all those folks that were studied? And, I can't wait to hear about all of that. So I'm happy that you're moving into anything that makes you happy. And yes, this was the first year that I was not an administrator, and it sounded like it was a very hard year to be an administrator. So I feel you, and I'm sure a lot of people can relate to how difficult it was. So let's shift gears, but still on this idea of bringing LGBT studies and LGBTQ experiences and histories and everything into the classroom. Tell us about the summer workshop that you're presenting at our conference this summer, as well as how it intersects with other things that you're doing, thinking about teaching in the next year and other work that you're doing.
Yeah. So the conference or the workshop that I'm going to be presenting at the conference, I'll be doing this with a couple of folks who are near and dear to me. Eric Martinez, who works in school and student health programs in San Francisco Unified School District, and who was my partner in developing and implementing LGBTQ studies in San Francisco Unified. He and I will be presenting. We've been working together a lot on bringing concepts and ideas and opportunities around this to schools and teachers since we started the class, since I started teaching the class in fall of 2015 when I started teaching the class. And then also Laura Nielsen, who is a current member of the cohort of Principal Leadership Institute and is writing her master's thesis on queer representation. And so the three of us are going to present a workshop on kind of how we did what we did in San Francisco Unified and how you can do that in your classroom or in your school. So we're going to go through starting out a little bit with the why. Why does it matter? Why does it matter if we know about the existence of trans or gender nonconforming people in ancient India, in ancient Asia, in Native American cultures and Native Canadian cultures? Why does it matter if we as adults or if young people know when an individual begins to be aware of their gender, when they begin to be aware of their sexual orientation? Why does it matter to help students understand or help all people understand the difference between gender expression and sexual orientation, between romantic attraction or friendship attraction? Like, all of these things matter. But there's a huge conversation going on right now nationwide where one group of folks thinks as long as we don't talk about any of that, as long as we just don't say a word, kids will grow up cisgender, heteronormative, et cetera, and then we won't have to even deal with any other options or any other possibilities. And I really believe that perspective is lacking in history, right? This is the importance of that storytelling, because we've had gender nonconforming people throughout history for as long as there has been documented history, right? We have Pope Joan, who was a woman who pretended to be a man in order to be the Pope of the Catholic Church for a while. We have all sorts of information about the non-heteronormative relationships of people like Franklin D. Roosevelt and Eleanor Roosevelt, or the gay representation in the Harlem Renaissance. I mean, there's just so much in our history. And I think for a long time, people who wrote history, people who were in positions of power, either didn't understand or didn't want to talk about it. And so they hid it and they hid it and they hid it and they hid it for generations and generations, partly because society wasn't accepting, partly because of maybe religious influence, or because of the patriarchy, all of these kinds of things. But now it's put us in a position as a country where there are people who really truly believe that this is new, that this is something that's just come up because progressives want it to. And that is such a misunderstanding of human nature. And I think bringing that concept of like, it matters because it's always been there. And also it matters because when young people see themselves in curriculum, when they feel that they are understood by the adults in their lives, they do better academically, they do better with attendance, they have higher graduation rates. There are studies that prove this in connection with ethnic studies, and we have early data on my class that shows that it had that same impact. And so I want to take people through that why, and then our how. You know, where did we start? We started with partnerships with the San Francisco LGBT Center. We started with Saturday morning or Saturday afternoon classes that kids could opt into if they wanted. And Eric was a big part of that. Unfortunately, because of a weekend thing and an off-site thing, not a lot of high school students wanted to spend an entire year dedicating their Saturdays to an academic class, right? And so it was much harder for students to make it through that full year of a class and to really learn those concepts. It was really only the kids who were desperately seeking representation of self who made it through the full thing. So how did we get it from this off-site bit to being offered in a classroom? It was about finding the right school to offer it at, finding the right student body population who could demonstrate the need for the class in order to get that first foot in the door, and also about filling the class, and finding curriculum and all of that stuff. So we're going to take everybody through kind of our step-by-step journey to getting it into the classroom and getting it board approved and everything else, and then provide some tools for folks to look at their organization. Who's in charge of curriculum development and planning, who certifies a course, how does it get put on your board, how would someone be qualified to teach it, what's different between California versus Illinois, where you could probably teach a class like LGBTQ studies if you had the right supportive team or school or district. But if you're in Texas, it's not going to be the same, right? You're probably not going to be wanting to bring this before your board of education right now. So what are your options? Where are your allies in the work? Where are your opportunities to be able to say, hey, students who identify as LGBTQ, or if you're questioning, like, here's some representation, so that you can make sure that they know that they are valid. So we're going to kind of help people map that out a little bit, and then give everybody an opportunity to explore through the curriculum that we have, which goes from ancient representation and etymology and just the basics of gender and sexuality, all the way up through the Black Lives Matter movement, which a lot of folks might not know, but it was started by the hashtag, the Black Lives Matter hashtag was really started by 3 queer women who they're in a position where they advocate, and their work with like the Black Futures Project and everything else puts them in a position of really speaking out around race more than around gender or sexuality, but it's a component of it. And that intersectional approach where we're looking at how does being a member of one marginalized class or marginalized group impact being a member of another, and why does it matter? We take it all the way up through that. And everyone who comes to my workshop will have access to every single piece of curriculum that I've collected or developed in connection with LGBTQ studies. Some of it's appropriate for elementary school, but most of it's about high school level. But we'll be available for questions, take people through some of the activities, little highlights of it, and then give folks time to really dig in and ask questions and figure out which pieces of it they can use in their curriculum starting this fall.
Awesome. So thanks so much. So look, quick message to the folks who are listening. I don't know anyone who knows more about this topic. Maybe you do, but for me, Lyndsey is super obviously experienced and passionate about lots of historical topics, but specifically making this curriculum and figuring out, how do I do it? How do I teach it? How do I set these conversations up? And also the systemic approach to how do I make it happen? How do I deal with resistance, which is a theme of this year's conference. Check it out. Follow her stuff, but specifically, she'll be doing her workshop on Wednesday, June 22nd. Check out her website that she'll talk about in a second as well, and the work that she's doing. And I'll just say, just to you, Lyndsey, I mean, that is huge, right? These programs only exist because people put it together, and they deal with resistance, and they deal with backlash, and they put in their extra time, their extra hours, whether that is, Black studies and women's studies, when that was the first time it was being introduced officially, or in this case, LGBTQ studies, right? So first, I just want to thank you for doing that work and impacting everybody that's going to be impacted by it. All right, let's switch gears a little bit as we think about coming out of this difficult year, getting ready to have summer, coming back to another year of working with young people. We're going to hit some hard times. Always, and we got to have our tried and true methods of re-energizing and refilling our cup. For you, what feeds your soul? What's feeding your soul these days? What are you looking forward to rejuvenating? How do you rejuvenate during the summer to get ready for the new year? What's filling your cup?
Yeah, well, time with my community. That's one of the reasons that I'm shifting career directions for a bit. I've been away from my community. The school that I worked at is about an hour and a half away from my home. And I'm going to actually now be only working 20 minutes away from my home. And so time with my community is a really big piece of it. But in addition to that, reading, I've been talking a lot on my Instagram about how excited I am to just spend the summer in my backyard with books. And so I've finished 3 books so far this summer. One, no, I have none of them to be able to show. But one of them was about historical fiction time travel and a battle between the theoretical followers of Senator Harriet Tubman versus the theoretical followers of Anthony Comstock in a fight for women's rights throughout timelines, which was really good. And then a book about a young woman who almost won the lottery, but then didn't. And then Colson Whitehead's Underground Railroad. So that's what I've gotten through so far. I want to reread all of my Adrienne Marie Brown books, especially Emergent Strategy, whenever I get too tired or feel let down or like the world is not going to allow people to be who they are and to seek joy. Emergent Strategy really helps me find ways to see possibility in connections between people and in reconnecting with nature and history. So those are big. I'm going to go see a few concerts. I have tickets to see the Backstreet Boys, along with a few other folks. And that's really big for me. But, you know, it's kind of funny, like lesson planning. I'm excited about lesson planning. Yeah, I think that's really it. I just want to be in the sunshine and reading books and listening to good music with my people. And then, of course, doing this work and teaching folks how to bring LGBTQ history in and being a snowplow and everything else.
Awesome. Cool. Well, that sounds like a great list. I think you can fill your whole summer up with that.
Absolutely.
Can you share with folks how to stay in touch with you, and what are some things they might expect from you in the future, whether that's some offerings, some workshops, some writing, some resources? What are some things that you got coming up?
Yeah. So for right now, Instagram and Twitter are probably your best bets for staying in touch with me. My Instagram is Miss Schlax, MSSCHLAX, and my Twitter is Miss Schlax. My students always think that that's a really original joke to make every year to call me that. So I've embraced it. It's MSSCHILLLAX. And I'll have a website launching soon. It'll be ready by the time we get to the conference. So if you come to my workshop, not only will you get this full Google Drive folder, but you'll also get an invitation to a section on my website where you can sign up for a workshop on an LGBTQ student-friendly first day, an inclusive first day of school, which I want to offer early August for anybody who's prepping. It'll just be a quick afternoon of talking about what might be in your syllabus, how you might want to let students introduce themselves, how to give safe space for them to tell you about their pronouns if they want to tell you what their pronouns or their identities are, and whether or not it's safe for you to use those pronouns with parents or other folks. So we'll do a quick, check back in around that LGBTQ inclusive first day. And then I want to be offering kind of a series of almost like what I want to call snowplow salons, which is, so as a cisgender straight white woman married to a cisgender man, I when I teach LGBTQ studies or when I talk about this, I'm not necessarily talking about my own story. But I know that teaching means that we're always telling stories that are not necessarily our own. And there is a way to do that without pretending it's your own story, right? Bringing in guest speakers, bringing in primary sources, having students read and share, all of those kinds of things. But there was because I'm a cisgender, straight, heteronormative woman, there were things that people couldn't quite accuse me of in starting LGBTQ studies, or they could accuse me of it, but it wasn't as sharp. It didn't hurt as much, right? With all of this national talk about like the idea of grooming, right? This is why we can't talk about gay stuff in schools in Florida, or you can't have gender affirming care for trans kids in Texas because people are scared about grooming. Those accusations carry a lot more weight when they're launched at someone who's a member of the community. And I've had those accusations sent at me, but I'm a straight cisgender heteronormative white woman. And so I've been able to deflect them a lot more easily, comments on news articles about whether or not I'm a woman, they don't sting the way that they would if my identity was different. And people tend not to glom onto them quite as much. They don't gather as much steam, perhaps, purely because of the privilege that I carry because of my identity. And so I kind of conceptualize this as me being able to be a snowplow, that because of my whiteness, I can move that cold white bullshit out of other people's way so that they can have what they need and deserve to be their full selves and to gain a full education. And I got a lot of wonderful experience working with other white folks while I was an administrator in affinity spaces, talking about being a snowplow in that way. And I want to offer that space to other folks because we don't all have a safe group of people to work in affinity with in our schools. And so I'm going to hopefully set up some monthly Thursday afternoon, Thursday evening snowplow salons where people can come and connect and we can just present dilemmas that we're having. How do I talk about this? How do I bring this up? How do I teach about this? How do I show allyship and show up for someone without taking up space? So there'll be more information about that ready once when I see everyone at the workshop, which I hope everyone will sign up for. It's going to be really fun.
Awesome. That sounds great. And as a person of color, I love that I have some help and somebody can clear the bullshit out of the way. It sounds great. So stay at it and find some people to work with on that. And I love that kind of partnership. Folks, definitely check out Lyndsey's work, whether that is now or in the future. If you're inspired by something she's talking about, but even just to like try to connect with, right? Because this work is best done in community, but you got to know who to connect with. She's a great person on many fronts. So with that, Lyndsey, I say thank you so much for making some time for this, doing the work you've been doing, the work you're going to do, the work you're doing this summer at the conference and everything after that. And have a good night and be well. Thanks so much for the time.
Thank you, Joe.
All right, folks, everybody else, peace out. We'll see you next time. See you later this summer. Bye.